What I'd like to do in this video is talk through a few ideas from Richard Routley's 1973 article, Is There a Need for a New and Environmental Ethic? This paper is important for really two reasons. One, an example that Routley gives in the paper, which has been a topic of subsequent discussion. It's the last man example. So I'll say more about that in a moment. The other reason that it's important is that it was one of the first statements among professional ethicists, among philosophers, professional philosophers and professional ethicists, of an attempt to articulate a non-anthropocentric ethics regarding the environment or regarding environmental issues. So Routley took up some aspect of the problems discussed by Leopold and raised a question, which was basically, can we address environmental issues fully can we address the question of what our moral obligations should be to the environment, or how we should be related to the environment, ethically speaking? Can we answer those questions on the basis of traditional Western ethical theories, or do we need some kind of new ethic in order to address them? And so this is what explains a lot of the discussion in the first few paragraphs of the essay about whether an application of an old ethic will suffice. That is, can we simply apply utilitarianism or apply some kind of duty-based approach or Kantianism to the new situation? Or do we need some kind of modification of that old ethic, perhaps? Perhaps we can't just apply the old ethic, but we have to modify it first. Or do we need to kind of continue down a pathway of what Leopold calls the ethical sequence and extend the old ethic in a certain way? So in a way that shows continuity with the older ethic, but still is something new? Or do we need an entirely new ethic? Now, Routley is positioning himself as arguing that we need an entirely new ethic, that there are aspects of the old ethic that mean that even an extension of it won't be adequate. But I think it doesn't matter that much whether we consider this an extension of the old ethic or a new ethic. It certainly does, though, seem to require something more than just a modification of the old ethic. At least it's very clear why Routley's argument suggests or indicates that we need we need a major change to the old ethic in some way. We need to add some new component to the old ethic. That's really the main point of Routley's essay, is we have to do something fairly radical with the inherited ethical theories like utilitarianism, Kantianism, or virtue ethics. We have to do something fairly radical in order to be able to adequately address our moral concerns, what should be our moral concerns about the environment, or another way to put it is what we recognize upon reflection as our true moral concerns for the environment. And Routley also early in the paper discusses the heterogeneity of the Western tradition of thinking about the human nature relation. So there are a number of different kind of strains of thought or schools of thought that have been part of the Western tradition. Routley is sort of assuming that we who are reflecting on this are primarily inheriting a tradition that passes through theories from ancient Greece and Europe. And it's interesting to wonder, with a lot of the stuff we read, actually, to what extent that's true. For instance, if people are reflecting on these questions, environmental questions, coming from India or Africa or China, maybe there's a different tradition that they would be primarily relating themselves to. But a lot of the one reason why it makes sense to think about and focus on the Western tradition to some extent is that those ideas have had an extremely wide currency, and they've been picked up around the world. And a lot of people think in terms of ideas that have their origin in the Western tradition, or at least were sort of central to the Western tradition. They may have their origin actually in Arabia or in other places, but or Egypt, but were picked up by the Western tradition and were sort of passed on through the Western tradition. So the Western tradition kind of has become a kind of global tradition by now. Of course, this doesn't rule out the meaningfulness of reflection on other traditions, which, where there are opportunities for that, I encourage you to do that. But anyway, Routley's concern is with kind of analyzing this Western tradition that he's seeing himself in 1973 as kind of like standing at the end of, so to speak. He's standing at the sort of, further reaches of it, and asking how adequate it is to account for what our relation to nature should be. And his conclusion is it's not really adequate. I mean, the tradition has not provided adequate resources for us. So but he does discuss, he mentions there are at least three major schools of thought. He's borrowing this typology of views about the human-nature relation from a historian of ideas, John Passmore, who wrote a book about basically the idea of human-nature relations in the Western tradition. So these three views are what Routley calls the despotic view, which is the view that human beings can just do whatever they want with nature. Basically, humans are like despots or tyrants in relation to nature. They can just dictate whatever they want done with nature and do it. So that there's nothing wrong with taking full control, full mastery, and basically taking a kind of conqueror role in relation to nature, as Leopold had described it. The other traditions are a stewardship view, that we humans can think of ourselves as stewards of nature, as sort of shepherds tending to a flock. It's sort of, people who care for things in nature, care for plants and animals. And then finally, there's a cooperative view, which holds that we can work with natural processes in order to do the various things that we do and live our lives. But Rowley thinks that each of these views really, for one thing, the despotic view seems to get most of the adherence. I mean, most of human action seems to follow currently the despotic view. So this is why he also calls this one the dominant view, meaning it's the most common view. And the other two don't really go far enough, he thinks, in recognizing what is valuable about nature in itself, we could say, or what's valuable about nature from a non-anthropocentric perspective. We're going to see more about why he thinks that in a moment. So in the next part of Routley's paper, he's searching for a kind of a single way of articulating what all of the Western ethical theories agree upon. And what he proposes here is something he calls the freedom principle. He recognizes that it may not be, human chauvinism is what he calls it, but he says that other people have sometimes called it the freedom principle. Now, he recognizes that this may not characterize every theory within the Western tradition, but it seems to call for a kind of broad agreement. And there are many ethical theorists, even very contemporary ethical theorists, who think that this principle is one that should be followed to whatever extent it can be. So it doesn't matter that much for our purposes, but I'll just mention John Rawls wrote a famous book in 1975 called A Theory of Justice. And one of Rawls's principles, though of course that book came out a few years after Routley's essay, but one of Rawls's principles is basically this principle, the freedom, what Routley calls human chauvinism, or the freedom principle. And Rawls doesn't talk about human relations to environments at all. So Rawls's book is one of the most famous books from that era, roughly the middle and second half of the 20th century. One of the most famous books about ethics. And this is one of his fundamental principles. Another ethical theorist, ethical and political theorist, Robert Nozick, wrote a book which is a kind of textbook of libertarian thinking, which libertarian thinking, I use the term libertarian to mean basically people who want minimum government, but want whatever government there is to protect property rights. So they want, there to be respect for institutions of property. People can own stuff and people can trade stuff, and there's a court system and police to enforce that. But there's very minimal taxation or no taxation. And so libertarianism is kind of a major part of the ideological strain of the contemporary Republican Party. But Robert Nozick, this libertarian theorist from the 70s, he also proposes a ethical principle that's very similar to this, human chauvinism, a principle as Routley calls it. So it's an extremely popular principle at the time that Routley is writing. It's generally thought to be something that sort of, whatever your ethical position is, you can probably agree with this. And so what Routley wants to do is pick up this chauvinism principle, and it basically just says, you can read it on the screen here, it says one should be able to do what they wish, providing that they don't harm others and that they're not likely to harm themselves irreparably. So, of course, Routley's expressing it with a he, but we can say they or she or, something gender neutral. The basic idea is that person should be able to do whatever that person wants to do as long as their actions don't hurt others and don't hurt themselves in a way that is irreparable, that is, can't be repaired. And so some people even strip it down just to the first one. People should be able to do whatever they want as long as it doesn't hurt somebody else. And this again, is something we hear people say a lot and seems like a pretty intuitive thing that we're often inclined to agree with, even though, if we think about it more, we might be able to come up with exceptions. But it does seem to be an attractive principle for a lot of people. And so what Routley now wants to do is to argue that if this is our fundamental ethical principle, it doesn't guide us sufficiently regarding our moral obligations to the environment.